So, welcome everyone to the Distinguished AI Lecture Series, organised in collaboration with the Department of Computing, Imperial College London. My name is Steve McDonough, and I'm a research lead at Huawei R&D, based here in our London Research Centre. Together today with my colleague, Matteo Maggioni, we're Imperial alumni that now hold research scientist posts in industry, and today we're standing in as hosts for our Imperial College colleagues, with whom we are organising this lecture series. So the idea of this lecture series is to invite interesting speakers from both industry and academia, whom are leaders in the AI and machine learning space, such that we can hear from them. And this is partly in lieu of in-person keynote talks that we're currently lacking. We have a website, ailectureseries.com, and this contains information on both our previous talks and also on our future events and the upcoming program. So please check that out if you're interested in further details. Okay, so after our summer break, we're now back with the third lecture talk in the Distinguished AI Lecture Series. And we've got a really exciting speaker, I think, a speaker for you today, who I'll now introduce. So with that, today I'm delighted to have with us Jean-François Lalonde. Jean-François is an associate professor in the Electrical and Computer Engineering Department at the University of Laval in Canada, where he's established a leading research group in visual computing and artificial intelligence. His research commonly involves exploring how physics-based models and data-driven machine learning techniques can be unified to better understand, to better model and interpret, and eventually to better recreate the richness of the visual world around us. This has led him and his group to breakthroughs in a wide variety of application areas, such as image editing, gaming and motion pictures, VR and AR, education and training, and recently autonomous driving. He regularly collaborates with both academic institutions at universities across Canada and internationally, and additionally also with industrial partners such as Adobe, Facebook, Disney Research, and various startups, where he's actively involved in bringing his research ideas to commercial products and technology transfer. And I think these points make him a really excellent fit to speak at this venue. So today, Jean-François has prepared an exciting presentation for us, and he'll speak about his work on learning-based image processing and differentiable compound optics. People are welcome to please post questions in the chat, and we can then put these to Jean-François in the Q&A session that follows the talk. So with that, I won't take any more time, and Jean-François, please, the floor is yours. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Stephen, for the great introduction, and thanks also for inviting me. I'm very happy to be here today to talk about our work. And so yes, today I'll be talking about differentiable compound optics and black box image processing for end-to-end camera design. So we'll talk about cameras and more generally imaging systems today. And of course, they can be found pretty much everywhere. They can be found in our cameras, of course, for photography, as well as our smartphones, but also in all kinds of other applications, including astronomy, automotive applications, microscopy, robotics, etc., etc. So cameras are all over the place. And each of these applications, in each of these cases, they use specialized optics and image processing pipelines that are typically handcrafted for each one of them sort of separately. So let's take a look at what happens when light comes into one of these cameras, right? So we have a light that travels from a scene into a camera. Then light will propagate through the optics and will hit a sensor, which will convert the photons to a raw signal. Then the raw signal will be fed to an image signal processor, whose task is going to be to convert it to either a nice looking image or an image that will be consumed by later downstream applications, such as computer vision network, let's say, that will detect the objects that are present in the image. So the question we're going to ask ourselves today is, how do we not only design such pipelines, but optimize each of these components such that we have the best possible performance at a given task? For example, we have the optics. What would be the best set of lenses and their parameters such that will produce maybe the best image that will be then consumed by this image signal processor, which will denoise it, demosaic it, etc. And how do I tune this ISP to produce the best image for the computer vision algorithm that will then, convert the pixels to bounding boxes? So that's the question we're going to ask ourselves. How do we optimize such imaging pipelines? And if we take a look at how this is done nowadays, this is done very much in isolation, in silos, right? Every single one of these steps is optimized independently of the others. For example, if we consider computer vision, which whose task is to take an image and perform a task on it, let's say classification, detection, segmentation, then this is more or less done independently of everything that comes before, right? If we, let's say we do classification on ImageNet, we don't really care how the ImageNet images were captured in the first place. We just take them as is and we train our approaches on them. And the exact same goes for the design and optimization of ISPs. The ISPs, they're typically tuned by experts who are really well trained in looking at the produced images and saying whether they like them or not, right? So experts will call them golden eye experts, and they will essentially spend months tweaking the parameters of the ISPs in order to, let's say for consumer photography, produce the best looking image possible. And the same goes for the optics. Optics engineer will create the lens designs by relying on heuristics such as the spot size. They want to minimize the PSF, let's say, or minimize the, obtain the best wavefront error, such that the image produced by the optics will be as good looking as possible. So what we'd like to do is, so the reason why we're stuck in this kind of piecewise manner is that, let's say we wanted to optimize the whole thing. Usually what we do, let's say in vision, right, we have these differentiable models. So we're going to compute the gradient or the derivative of the loss function with respect to some weights. And we're only going to be able to back propagate it through, let's say, the vision network, because that thing is differentiable. And the gradients will kind of be stopped at the ISP, right? And even if we were able to progress a little bit more, then we'd still be stuck at the optics. So this is the obstacle that has prevented end-to-end camera design. ISPs and camera optics are going to be designed sort of independently because they're non-differentiable. Oftentimes they're black box. They're going to be designed once and for all and used over and over for different applications. So the question we'd like to ask ourselves today is, can we do better, right? Can we go and can we actually propagate the gradients all the way through the whole imaging pipeline? So this is going to be the goal today of this talk, right? Where I'm going to be presenting methods that will lift these constraints and allow for full end-to-end imaging pipeline optimization, where the goal is that we're going to want to jointly determine what is the best optical design, what is the best set of ISP hyperparameters, and what is the best set of neural networks weights that optimize the performance for a given task. And I'd really like to highlight the point here, the for a given task is a very important point here, because we might want to use like the same camera or the same more or less optical design, ISP, etc., but for a different task, right? So then can we optimize the same camera for another task and then get a different set of optics, a different ISP hyperparameters, and maybe different neural network weights, such that it will adapt to this other task. All right. So this is going to be the plan for today. And throughout the talk, the key idea that is going to make it all work, we're going to present models that are both differentiable and that will mimic the behavior of these non-differentiable components. So we'll have a differentiable model that imitates what the ISP does, and we'll have another one that imitates what the optics do. And once we can replace the real and optics and the ISP with these differentiable models, that will give us a proxy that will be full end-to-end differentiable, that will allow us to recover what the best parameters for the whole imaging pipeline is. Sounds good? All right, so that's the plan. So we'll split the talk into two main parts. To get started, we'll look at how we can optimize ISP hyperparameters. And then the second part of the talk, we'll discuss the optics. This first part of the talk has been the subject of a paper published at SIGGRAPH in 2019. And I do want to point out that this is a joint work with Ethan, Yuting, Fahim from Princeton and Algolux, who have been working under the direction of Felix Heidi, who is a professor at Princeton, as well as the CTO of Algolux, who's a small company, which is a small company in Montreal. So I've been this is a joint work with these guys. Okay, so let's talk about ISPs. Let's first consider what are the difficulties and constraints of these ISPs. So what does an ISP do? Well, it converts a raw image to essentially a good-looking RGB image on the other end. And in order to do so, it relies on many different steps, which can include things like bad pixel correction, black level correction, demosaicing, denoising, correcting for the lens, tone mapping, image enhancing, etc., etc. And so all of these sort of sub-steps inside the ISP contain parameters that will adjust each of these algorithms according to, well, essentially the way they work, right? And what's complicated here is that the set of parameters here span a high-dimensional parameter space that is mixed between continuous and discrete variables. Oftentimes, what makes it even harder is that ISPs, especially hardware ISPs, are not only non-differentiable, but they're black box, right? We don't actually know what are the series of steps and especially how they're implemented inside of the ISP. We don't know that. The only thing we know are the parameters we can control in order to change the appearance of the image that's being produced. And our goal is that we'd like to tune the parameters towards almost any task metric. So essentially, every time we're given a new task, then we have to switch and change the parameters in order to get a different output that hopefully will be well suited for that task. And as I was mentioning before, the way that this is typically done in the industry nowadays is to rely on these GoldenEye experts who are especially trained to look at these images that are being produced by the ISP, and will hopefully, after a lot of trial and error, hopefully come up with a solution or a set of parameters that will optimize such and such metrics for a given task. So our goal is to replace the GoldenEye expert using an automated technique that will automatically then discover or realize what the parameters are for this particular task. And as I mentioned before, the key idea here is that we're going to more or less replace the ISP with what we'll call a differentiable proxy function, which will imitate what the ISP is doing, and that will help us figure out what the right set of parameters are. So to present the approach, I'll split that into two stages. So the first stage is going to be to learn the differentiable proxy function, and the second stage will be the optimization of the hyperparameters for a task-specific output. Let's begin by stage one. So here we're going to be given a black box ISP that will apply a certain function f to an image, right? So the ISP takes an image as input, as well as a set of hyperparameters that will guide or that will tell the ISP what to do with this image. And then again, I just want to highlight the fact that it's a black box. That's why I drew it that way, right? So we don't actually know what's happening inside. Now, if I give it an image and I give it a set of parameters p, the ISP will produce me an output image as output here, shown here on the right? So this is going to be, O of ISP is going to be the function, unknown function f applied to the image and the set of parameters p. Now, what I can do is that I can query the ISP many times, essentially by feeding it, let's say, the same image, but by changing the set of parameters, I can query it and sort of build this sort of training set, right? That will say, for this set of parameters, I will get this image. For this other set of parameters, I will get this other image. For this third set of parameters, I will get this third image, etc., etc. I can do this very many times. And when I do this, what I can further do is then replace or sort of build this neural network. Here I'm just using a UNet, right? So build this neural network that will take as input the same image as well as the same set of parameters. And here the way we are going to take the parameters is simply by concatenation. So we'll just insert, copy the parameters as a full layer and insert them or through concatenation at various stages of the encoder. So this is how the network works. And then using our training data that we've acquired with our real ISP, we can define a loss function that will optimize over and try to find what is the best set of weights that will, such that the neural network will approximately do the same thing as the real ISP does. All right. So here, this proxy, we'll call it the F proxy, takes as input the image, the set of parameters P, as well as the a set of weights W, and will produce an output image. After we train this thing, then this F proxy will take in this sort of optimal set of weights W star, and we'll hope that if we've done this enough, we've had enough training images and we've had enough training time, then this function F proxy will be a good approximation to what the ISP actually does to the images. All right, so what we've done here is that we've essentially replaced our real ISP, that's black box, that's non-differentiable, we don't know what it's doing. We've replaced it with a differentiable machine, being the UNet in this case, that will replicate what the ISP does. So it does essentially the same thing, but this time it's differentiable. So we'll be able to backpropagate the gradients through it. And that brings us to our second stage, which is that of optimizing the hyperparameters for task-specific outputs. So let's go back to our UNet. And in this stage, we assume that the UNet has already been trained, right? It's already been trained to mimic what the ISP is doing. So in this case, we will fix its set of weights. Okay, so the weights here are fixed. We're not going to train them anymore. And now we'll be given a task-specific input, random set of hyperparameters to begin with, and this will produce an image which will more or less be random at the beginning as well. Now we'll compare it with a task-specific target, define a loss function that we can backpropagate through the neural network without changing its weights, but all the way to the input parameters P, and after optimization, hopefully we'll find the right set of parameters that will best match the task-specific target. All right, so we'll obtain our P star, which is the optimal hyperparameters for the proxy. And given that the proxy approximates what the ISP is doing, hopefully the set of hyperparameters P star will be a good will also be good for the ISP. And what if we're given a different task? In this case, all we have to do is to replace the input, the target, and the loss function, for example, for automotive object detection. And we can do exactly the same, backpropagate through the proxy that has fixed weights all the way to the input parameters P, and get this sort of P star, which will hopefully maximize the performance of the same ISP, but on a different task. And now that we have the set of parameters P star rather, we can deploy them on a real ISP. All right, so this is a real ISP that we trained a proxy for, and then we can feed it some real images coming from a camera and obtain an output image that will be good for detection in this case. Okay, so this was the overview of the approach. Essentially, in a nutshell, replace a non-differentiable black box thing by a differentiable neural network that learns to do the same thing as this ISP. And once it's trained, fix its weights, and then backpropagate through all the way to the input parameters in order to find what's the best set of hyperparameters for a given task. So we've tried this approach on different tasks. All right, so the 3 different tasks that I want to talk to you about. The first one is natural image optimization. Then we'll have low light denoising. And the third one is object detection for autonomous cars. And what's common across all these 3 tasks is that, well, it's always the same approach. All right, the only thing that we need to change is the set of input and targets, as well as loss functions. And once we have that, then the entire optimization scheme is exactly the same, which shows that our approach is really flexible and can really adapt to many different scenarios. Let's start with the natural image optimization. So for this, we're going to take as a study ISP, right? We'll take the ARM Mali C71 hardware ISP, which is a real-world again hardware ISP that has many parameters, and this is an overview of the parameters that it takes. So you have parameters for white balance, demosaicing, denoising, color tone correction, color space conversion, etc. And all of these parameters span, as I said before, right, a high dimensional and mixed set of mixed space, both of continuous and discrete variables. So it's very hard to optimize over this hyperparameter space. It's a black box, so we don't actually know what's going on inside, right? This is proprietary to ARM, and we don't know what's going on. So it's black box, and it's also non-differentiable, so we cannot backpropagate through it. It's an actual real, real set of electronics sitting on a board, so we can't backprop through it. And it's difficult to tune towards arbitrary task metrics. All right, so what we'll do is that we'll train this proxy, we'll train our proxy, software proxy for this hardware ISP. So the way we do it is that we're going to acquire the proxy training data using a hardware in the loop system that is shown here on the right. So we have this screen that is calibrated to a camera. The camera is hooked up to the ISP. We can kind of see the board here in the foreground of the image. And this ISP will image convert the raw images to RGB images, and the screen is calibrated to the camera, so we have a pixel-to-pixel match between the images, the image that is shown on the screen, as well as the images that are produced by the ISP. So this is an example of a calibration image that is shown on the screen on the right, and the corresponding captured raw image that is shown here on the left. All right, so we have this, as I said, one-to-one correspondence between pixels in the calibration image and the captured raw image. So we know that given this input calibration image, we have as output, the ISP has produced the captured raw image. And this is also a programmable board, right? So we can actually input the set of parameters on the board and recuperate the image that's been produced. So this is done as a hardware in the loop system, and we can capture and acquire very many images that way. Then we'll take these images, and so we're feeding these images again, as I said, to this C71 ISP, collect the training images, and use it to train the proxy. And as the stage 2 for this image quality task, then we'll set this rainbow calibration chart as a target image, and define the task loss as being a sum of 2 losses. So the L1 loss that we wish to recover the input image, and as well as the perceptual loss commonly used in computer vision, which uses a pre-trained neural network and computes the similarity of the features that have been learned by the deep network. And we found that this set of parameters enabled the C71 to capture natural images. And here's just kind of an overview of how the optimization performs. So at the beginning, it starts with a null sort of blue image and quickly converges to something that's much more reasonable. Here's a look of a comparison of 2 different images, essentially of the same scene, using a set of parameters that have been tuned manually by an expert, shown here on the left, and the parameters that have been obtained automatically using our proxy, shown here on the right. And if we zoom in, we can actually see that, well, both images are very good quality, of course, but maybe the image on the right is perhaps a little bit sharper. And I'm going to show you some more examples in a second, but just to give you a sense of how much time it takes. So the expert tuning took 3 months, and the automatic proxy tuning took about 3 hours once the proxy was trained. Okay, so this is, even within 3 hours, we got better looking results qualitatively, but also quantitatively if we compare or compute many different metrics, such as the perceptual loss, the detail accuracy, color accuracy, etc. We can see that in all cases, the proxy optimized results obtained significantly better performance than the one that was the one obtained using the parameters, the manually tuned hyperparameters. And this is both for the 1x and the 16x gain cases. And one nice thing that we can do as well is that, let's say we wanted to have the ISP produce let's say, more colorful images with perhaps a little bit more sharpened edges. Now, of course, we could go back to the hyperparameters and say, okay, we already have a good starting point. Now let's try to boost the saturation, or let's try to boost the sharpness. But of course, that's hard to do because we don't really know what the parameters are doing. So instead, what we can do is simply change the target, right? So we're going to take this original natural target, and we're going to just increase its saturation and increase the edges, so with some sort of sharpening or something. And then if we compare side by side, we can see the original target and the enhanced target. And then we can just rerun this training scheme and have the ISP match this edge enhanced high color contrast target. And if we do so, then we have the original image on the left and this output of this high color contrast image produced on the right. And we can kind of zoom into to two regions here to give you a sense of what this actually means in practice, right? So of course, clearly on the right, the colors are much more vivid and the edges are much sharper. Okay, so that was it for the natural image optimization. Now let's take a look at low light denoising. And for the purposes of this experiment, we'll actually use a different ISP. So not a hardware ISP, rather a software ISP, which is going to be the well-known BM3D denoising algorithm. So BM3D has been proposed more than 10 years ago and also contains a parameter space that is mixed between continuous and discrete, and that is non-differentiable and as well black box. There are some implementations or hardware implementations of BM3D that we have no idea what they're doing. And for the purposes of this evaluation, we'll use the smartphone image denoising dataset, which contains pairs of noisy and noiseless images captured with smartphones. And in this case, we'll use the same, of course, stages as before. So the stage one, we'll use our noisy images, pass them through BM3D, and obtain the output given by BM3D using a bunch of hyperparameters. And then stage two, and we'll fit the proxy to that. And the stage two will be given noiseless images as targets and optimize the hyperparameters of BM3D in order to get the best performing result. So qualitatively, this is what we obtained. So here on the right is a zoomed in version of the image on the left. So this is the input noisy image. Now this is BM3D with the default hyperparameters. So we can see, it does maybe a little bit, but it's pretty subtle. And there's still plenty of noise left in the final output. This is the same algorithm, exactly the same algorithm, BM3D still, but with a different set of optimized hyperparameters. And we can see that it does a whole lot better. And if we can compare this with the long exposure image. So we ran this sort of systematic and exhaustive evaluation comparing our method with a bunch of previous works, but don't worry about all this. We'll go through. I'll highlight some important details or some important results that I'm highlighting here, and also showing sort of zooming in on the right. So these are the results obtained by the original BM3D with its sort of default set of hyperparameters on the SIDD dataset. And as you can see, PSNR of 25 or so and SSIM of 0.68. If we compare this with the at the time state of the art, which was CBDNet. CBDNet is a neural network that is trained to denoise. Okay, so this is essentially another software ISP that is based on neural networks, and this gains a pretty big boost in performance of 33 in PSNR and 0.86 of SSIM. And if we compare this with our results, which essentially uses, again, the same BM3D, it's exactly the same algorithm as what was there in 2007, except that now we've optimized its hyperparameters on this task using our differentiable proxy. We can actually beat a neural network that was trained on this task and bring the PSNR all the way up to 34.3 and this SSIM to 0.91. This result I really like because I think it really shows sort of the power of the approach, and goes to show that the solution, or rather the algorithm, was there all along, right? BM3D is a great algorithm and it works really well, except that it is sensitive to its parameters and it's very complicated to optimize. So BM3D was there all along. We just didn't know what the right set of hyperparameters were, at least for this data set. And using this proxy optimization, we could actually find a set of parameters that's able to make it beat the state of the art, just given a better set of parameters. And this brings me to the final example for this ISP optimization, which is that of object detection for autonomous cars. And in this case, what we'll do is that we'll have our trained ARM C71 proxy, and we'll just append a deep neural network trained for detection to it. And in this case, we'll be using the faster RCNN method. All right, and then if we're given a task, the task that comes all the way after the object detection, we can back propagate. Of course, we'll feed in the parameters, the image, then we can back propagate through the whole pipeline, through the faster RCNN network, through the proxy, all the way to its input parameters in order to determine what is the best set of hyperparameters for that task. So we can jointly train the proxy, the C71 ISP rather, as well as the faster RCNN network, so that they can both kind of work hand in hand, all right, to get P star. So let's take a look at what we can obtain. I'll just skip over this thing. Okay, so object detection results. So we found that doing so increased the set of true positives. So I'm just showing here an image of the expertly tuned ISP and the proxy optimized ISP. You can see that the images produced by the ISP on the right-hand side are perhaps a little bit blurrier and not as sharp as the ones that are produced by the expert tuned. But it turns out that the neural network doesn't hate that. In fact, it actually prefers this and is able to detect this car in the background that was not previously detected. Another example where we decrease the number of false positives. And finally, some results that show that we have tighter bounding boxes, and also showing some quantitative results that for essentially all the metrics that we've computed, including the mean average precision, the number of false negatives, true positive, etc., across all the three different classes that we've tested on. In all cases, right, the optimized ISP or the optimized ISP with the neural net always works better. I do want to show you some videos. So this is object detection comparison, which maybe is a little bit hard to see, but you can see that in most cases we get better performance on the right-hand side. But I'll switch immediately over to the object tracking results, which I think are perhaps a little bit easier to see, where we're tracking objects persistently throughout the frames. Right, you can see that in the right-hand side, which is the proxy optimized result, you get a lot more true positives and a lot more detections and successfully tracked objects as on the left. All right, so that's it for the first part of the talk, where I presented a way to automatically optimize the hyperparameters of ISPs, which works on high-dimensional parameter space that contains both the continuous and discrete set of parameters, and that works with non-differentiable and black box ISPs. And when we tune it towards arbitrary task metrics, it actually outperformed the state-of-the-art in all of the applications that were tested, whether it's natural image optimization, low light denoising, as well as object detection for autonomous vehicles. Sounds good. Okay, so this was part one of the talk. Now let's move on to part two, where we're going to see whether we can, or how rather, we can backpropagate the gradients from the task through the vision network, through the ISP, and now we want to make it all the way to the optics. And this second part of the talk will focus on the contents of the paper that was published earlier this year at SIGGRAPH. That was presented at SIGGRAPH 2021. And again, this is work of the same set of folks, Ethan over here, we have Fahim, Carl, etc., that's been led by Felix Heide at Princeton. And this was a very nice collaboration with them. So optics design software, they're typically unsuitable for task-specific applications, such as object detection, because they allow for isolated designs, right? So people employ heuristic merit functions, such as the minimizing the RMS spot size that is produced by the lenses, which means that this is more or less a black box, optimization method that is presented, or that is available in the commercial tools, such as Zemax or Code 5. And this means that we'll design the optics in isolation, and hopefully we'll use the same optics for both viewing tasks, such as cell phones or photography, as well as detection tasks, such as automated driving. The good thing about them, though, is that they'll support a vast suite of existing designs, whether it's glass surfaces, material types, and so on. There's thousands of designs available online. You can download them, you can play with them, you can ray trace through them using these tools. So it's actually a very nice set of tools, except that they don't work hand in hand with the rest of the pipeline very well. So in this work, we kind of want to bridge this gap, right, between what's going on inside of these tools and the powerful things they allow us to do. But we want to plug them essentially with the rest of the imaging pipeline design. So our work, we want to build differentiable compound optics models. And for this, we're going to rely on modeling what is called the spatially varying point spread function, or the PSF, of a compound optic. And the PSF is essentially the response to an impulse function. And it varies as a function of the angle, more or less, or as a function of the field, right? So we have over the whole image plane, the PSF is non-constant and varies as a function of its distance to the center of the image. It also varies as a function of optics parameters, right? Such as the lens radius, the conic constant, the coefficients of the higher order terms, the spacing between the lenses, the glass material type, etc. Okay, so the PSF is a function of all of these things. If we take a look, for example, at a Cook triplet, which is a conventional design in optics, the optimizable parameters for the Cook triplet consist of all of these things, which essentially are the shape of each lens surface, as well as the distances between the lenses. So if we take a look at what existing tools for optics design software, such as Zemax, what they allow us to do is that they're able to simulate really precisely what the PSFs of a given lens designs will be. All right, so we can feed them, as I said before, they're very powerful, right? We can feed them all of these parameters, lens radius, conic constant, etc., and obtain the PSF. But unfortunately, because they're black box, they make them unsuitable for end-to-end design. So I think now you see me coming, and basically we're going to use the same approach as in the first part of the talk. That is, learn using a neural network, learn to reproduce what the Zemax ray tracer does. Okay, learn to do the same, but this time using a differentiable thing, which will allow us to backpropagate gradients through it all the way back to the input parameters. Okay. So this is going to be the same intuition as in the first part of the talk, but this time instead of ISP, we'll be applying it to the optics. Now I'll describe our method in detail. So the entire chain, entire imaging chain, will be composed of differentiable components. The ISP, the optics, the ISP, the neural network, all the way to the task. So let's take a look at the optics first, because this is the novel part of this second part of the talk. Mentioned before that the single spatially invariant PSF is not going to be sufficient for modeling these nice optics. So we really want to have spatially varying PSFs modeled here. So how do we take this sort of ideal scene image here that represents the radiance, the scene radiance, and convert it to what would be imaged by the optic? Well, we're going to employ an array of spatially varying PSFs that we see here on the bottom left. And this is going to be modeled by this function g, right, which takes as input an x and y, so that's a position on the image plane, as well as a set of optics parameters, and will produce a PSF. Given this PSF, we will patchwise convolve it with the scene in order to get this convolved patch, and then we'll do this for every patch in the scene and produce this image that has been formed by the compound optics. Okay, so this is how we go from the scene to the image produced right after the optical system. Now let's take a look at our proxy for the optics. Now this g-optic function, we can implement it, as I said before, with the Zemax ray tracer to obtain the PSF at a given position, as well as the vignette, which corresponds to sort of the attenuation of light, given interreflections inside the lens, etc. But they're of course non-differentiable, so we're going to approximate using an optics neural network that I show here below. This optics neural network will take as input exactly the same components, that is the theta, which represents the angle of the incident light ray, as well as the set of optical parameters p. this will take this as input and produce exactly the same thing as output as well, the approximation to the PSF, as well as an approximation to the vignette factor. This neural network will be trained with a combination of losses. I won't go into the details here. I'm happy to discuss afterwards. That are both over the PSF as well as the net. If we take a look at the architecture of the neural network, it's actually split into two stages. The first stage is an MLP, or multi-leaf perceptron, that takes as input the parameters of the optics as well as the field, and produces a latent vector inside of the neural network, as well as the vignette directly. And the second stage is a convolutional decoder, which will produce the PSF as output. Now we can do as we did before, so we're going to vary the P optic, render with the Zemax ray tracer to get a bunch of training data, and then train the neural network to replicate what the Zemax ray tracer does. Once the network has been trained, we then fix its weights and move on to the second stage of the optimization, which is essentially the same as in the first part of the talk. All right, so that's that for how we model the optics. And now if we go back to the end-to-end camera design pipeline, the only thing that's missing now is the sensor, right? So before, in the first part of the talk, we were talking about ISPs, neural networks, etc., which was all good. But now this time, if we're going to talk about the optics, we also need a differentiable sensor model. So for this, we have a fully differentiable sensor model that follows the EMVA 1288 standard and converts the radiance from the incoming scene to a Bayer raw reading. Okay, so it converts the radiance produced by the optics all the way to the raw image that is being fed to the ISP and then further down the pipeline. And for whatever comes next, then we've already talked about this, right? The ISP is already differentiable through our differentiable proxy model from the first part, and the neural network, we can append essentially any neural network to it and define more or less any task and optimize over the whole pipeline. So now this is the full end-to-end differentiable camera pipeline that contains parameters for the optics, the ISP, the neural network, that they can all be optimized for a given task. Just a word about end-to-end optimization. I keep talking about end-to-end, but we don't actually optimize everything end-to-end by just saying go and letting everything run. We actually, in the paper, proposed this proximal optimization, which optimizes sort of every block independently in a sequence, right? So we can optimize a few steps of gradients on the vision, few steps of gradients on the ISP while keeping everything else fixed, few steps of gradient descent on the compound optics while keeping everything else fixed, etc. And we optimize over this. So I'm not going to go into too many details at this point. I'm happy to talk about it afterwards. But we found that actually this works a whole lot better than just trying to say, okay, initialize randomly and hope for the best by optimizing every single parameters together. Okay, so this is what the optimization process looks like. I will play the video in a second, but just before, on the left, you'll see the PSF, the spatially varying PSF of the nominal optics design. And here the nominal optics was obtained using traditional tools, essentially the optimizer that's available within Zemax, which is a commercially available software. In the middle is going to be the PSF of our end-to-end optimization over time. So this will change in a sec when I play the video. And the corresponding loss on the right-hand side, this is the training curve. All right, let's play this animation. So as you can see, the PSF in the middle gets sharp very early down the line, and then as the training progresses, it will sort of fine-tune, the PSFs on the periphery in order to perform as well as it can on the given task. So for the experimental results for this paper, we experimented on 3 domain-specific optics for 3 diverse tasks, namely natural image capture, object detection, as well as traffic light detection. And I want to point out that in all of these 3 cases, we actually had real lenses manufactured for these 3 different applications. So we have a single lens that's called the nominal 1, which was obtained using the Zemax hammer, that's called. and 3 other lenses, one for natural image capture, one for object detection, one for traffic light detection. All right, and we had them in the autonomous vehicle scenarios. We actually installed them inside of the car, captured some data using the 2 cameras, labeled them, and actually compared performance on both of them. All right, so this is an extensive set of real experiments that I want to mention. And while we did some experiments on natural image capture, I will, in the interest of time, I will skip over those. And if we have time, I'm happy to come back to them during the question period. But we will spend some time talking about the automotive applications, namely object detection, as well as traffic light detection, because I think there's some kind of very interesting observations in these 2 scenarios. All right, so let's take a look at object detection. So in this case, our task is to optimize the set of optics parameters, the hyperparameters of the ISP, as well as the neural network, which is again a faster RCNN, in order to minimize the intersection over union loss. Okay, when we try to detect objects in, for example, cars and pedestrians in an automated driving scenario. And just to give you a sense of the number of weights that we need to figure out, well, of course, for the faster RCNN, we have a whole lot of weights, right? 256,000 weights to determine, but that's, I guess that's nowadays becoming more and more common to do in the computer vision literature. But in addition to that, we need to figure out all the parameters of the C71 ISP, which is a real hardware ISP, as well as the parameters of the Cook triplet that is the optics that we use to perform this experiment. All right. So that's our goal. So we are going to jointly optimize the entire imaging, the set of imaging pipeline, and get those optimized parameters. This is, in a nutshell, what the difference between the optics are. So this is the nominal optics on the left-hand side that is tuned to just produce nice-looking images in general. And the end-to-end optimized on the right-hand side, you can see that the optimization process finds an optic with a slightly shorter focal length and a slightly lower F number, which actually provides higher contrast in lower flux regions. Looking at the produced PSFs over the different fields, what's interesting here is that there is quite a difference, right? You can see the nominal PSF on the bottom, where the one in the middle of the field is actually quite sharp, and it becomes a little bit less blurry in this sort of line, right, as you move away from the center of the image. Now, contrast this with what we get with the end-to-end optimization, where at 0 degrees, this is much more blurry, I guess, as what you would get in the nominal case, right? However, what's interesting here is that the aberrations that are present in the PSF are more or less constant over the field. All right, so it's much more uniform as opposed to what we see in the nominal design. And that's actually helpful to the neural network because it makes the detections easier for the neural net, since the object shape will not be affected or be less affected by its spatial position within the field of view, right? We know that convolutions should be more or less translation invariant. So we want things to look the same, whether it's the bottom left, bottom right, or bottom left of the image, as opposed to present in the middle. Okay, so this is what the optics is trying to do here, is trying to make things more consistent throughout the field of view of the camera. So this is an in the wild example. So let's zoom in here because some of the differences are a little bit subtle to see. But on the left here, we can see that it's missing a person, whereas it's correct, and the bike is being misclassified, whereas we correctly classify using the end-to-end optimized, and we also correctly detect the car on the right-hand side. Another example here where it's able to detect many more cars in the background as opposed to the nominal design, and there's also a traffic sign that was misdetected that is correct on the right-hand side. Quantitatively speaking, we get, again, better performance in all cases using the end-to-end optimized design compared to the nominal, where we go from 40 mean average precision on this task all the way up to 46, simply by having optics that work hand in hand with the ISP as well as the neural network. The last example I want to show is the traffic light detection. which is quite similar in the sense that we're going to use the specific optics, the Mali C71 ISP, as well as the faster RCNN network in order to detect traffic lights. And in this case, similar to the optic optimized for object detection, we also have a lower F number as well as a shorter focal length. And now that's the optimization has resulted in a different PSF though. All right, so as opposed to the object detection case where the PSF was more or less uniform across the field, if you remember, in this time we have a PSF that's sharp in the middle and that becomes quite a lot blurrier around the edges, and that actually stays sharper in smaller fields compared to the nominal design. And that's actually due to the case that when you have traffic lights, they're overhanging and they're usually visible from far away, right? And they're sort of in the middle of the field of view most of the time. So they remain longer in the visual field. So the optimization sort of puts more importance to that and realizes this from the training set and is able to say, wait, I really need sharp PSFs in the middle of my field of view. And I can just kind of, it's not that important if it becomes a little bit blurrier outside the field of view, or sort of at the periphery of the field of view. Here's an example. Again, I'm just going to zoom in because some of them are hard to see. So on the bottom right, you can see that on the right inset that the green straight has been correctly detected, and the top left, it thinks that it's a red circle where it should be an arrow. So here is correctly detected. Same for this example, where as I was saying, the red circle again and the green straight have been correctly detected on the right hand side, and here should have been an arrow. All right, so we also, when it's correctly detected here, we obtained a higher confidence on the right hand side, so of 98% compared to 62. And again, quantitatively obtain better mean average precision over the on the overall, but for all of the classes individually as well. All right, so we are nearing the end. So in order to summarize what I've presented, we've proposed an end-to-end camera design method that leverages fully differentiable models of both the image signal processor, the ISP, as well as the compound optics that allows us to backpropagate gradients from the given task-specific loss all the way through the whole imaging pipeline, and hopefully get better parameters or better optics that work hand in hand with the ISP, that also work hand in hand with whatever computer vision algorithm we want to apply to. So we believe that for the first time we can design entire cameras, including the optics, the hardware ISPs, and the downstream methods. Hopefully going forward, there's some, I think this opens the area for many exciting applications, different types of research, including, for example, sensor design that we haven't looked at. We just use a sort of a traditional sensor model to this that we made differentiable, but this would be exciting to look into the space of sensor design parameters as well. And hopefully this will be used for all kinds of applications, such as the ones I've mentioned earlier. And with that, I would like to thank you for your attention. Thanks again for inviting me, and I'll be very happy to take questions.
All right. So thank you very much, Jean-François, for the truly interesting talk. That was very, very inspiring. Thank you. So I'd ask audience members, please post questions in the chat, and then we can pick those up with Jean-François. Maybe I can start a bit there.
Sure.
If I may, so you have these very powerful end-to-end joint optimization frameworks, and they're producing very impressive results. And I guess you're jointly training, if I understand correctly, all parameters and hyperparameters for what is a fairly heterogeneous camera pipeline, right? And I guess my question is, when a new task of interest turns up, say a sort of a downstream task, are we resigned there to sort of, do we want to start from scratch each time, or I guess you sort of see where I'm getting to? What do we want to share? Are there any reusable parts? Or interested to get your comment on this side.
Right, that's a great question, and I mean, to be fair, I think there's still, if I go back to my slide, right, there are some assumptions that we made in this work, and for example, the ISP, right, we choose an existing ISP as a starting point, right, like the C71 or BM3D for denoising, or you could also have a differentiable, a neural network as an ISP, etc. We also started with, let's say, for the optics, a Cook triplet, right? So the Cook triplet has 3 lenses. So the model is not going to add another lens, right? So it's going to be kind of stuck there. So I think there is still need at this point for I would say intuition and sort of domain expertise for each one of these applications. So I think there's still very much the use for that. We're hoping that we can make this more and more flexible in the future. Oops. But yeah, at this point there still needs to be some expertise involved. And if you wanted to, let's say, to kind of get back to your question about what do we need to do given a new task. If anything, I think this kind of tool helps us get to where we want to go faster. Right, so we might not be able to just hit one button and have everything optimized right now today on September 13, 2021. But this might be able to say, okay, I'd like to use this ISP maybe with this kind of optical system, right? Now let me train the proxies, which takes maybe 24 hours or so, and then let me optimize it, right? So within maybe a couple of days, I can know what would be a good performance that I can obtain using this choice that I made originally. Right? Instead of having to wait 2 months. So then maybe I can iterate this process many times, right? Over the course of maybe a month or so, and try a whole bunch of different configurations that I might not have had time to do so, otherwise, right? So do you see what I'm going with this? So I think this would be a design, sort of a meta design tool that you can try these sort of overall imaging pipeline designs and get to where you want to go faster.
Right. Thank you. Very interesting. And okay, let me jump to some audience questions. And maybe just to pick up firstly, I guess it's somewhat related to just where we were talking about now. Somebody's asking about what's the training time needed for the differentiable optics modeling network, and how good is the network performing in compared to the Zemax built-in optimization module?
Right. So I'll have to look more carefully at those details. But if I remember correctly, for the proxy training, right? So when we want to replicate what the optics are doing in this case, this probably takes, I would say, probably a couple of days just to train the proxy, right? Once you have the proxy trained, then you can optimize faster to some tasks. But just training that takes a while. And there's also a question about how it's comparing, how good is performing compared to Zemax, let's say. Of course, it's an approximation to what Zemax is doing, in the sense that we use Zemax to generate the training data, and then fit, train the neural network to fit it as best we can. And in this case, as I was mentioning, as the answer to your question, Stephen, before, right, we are still kind of restricting it to, let's say, the space of Cook triplets. Okay, so this is still a fairly restricted space. Although in the paper we tried it was like a 12 lens element, so much more like a photography objective. Yes. But anyway, so back to the Cook triplet, it's still a fairly limited design space, and it's able. So we had some metrics as well on there, and it's able to do a fairly good job at replicating what it's doing.
Got it. Thank you very much. And a very quick follow-up from the same question. There's if you used instead a differentiable ray tracer, and the example being given is Mitsuba 2.0 or similar instead, how do you have any comment on what would, I guess, in terms of time and quality is I guess people are interested in.
Right. Yeah, that's a really great question. To be honest, at the time where we started doing this work, Mitsuba 2 had I think just came out, so couldn't play with that too much. My intuition is that this will still be a lot faster to just pre-train, let's say, this MLP followed by a convolutional decoder, as I was presenting. So it'd probably be a lot faster than back propagating through Mitsuba. Although it'd be interesting to try, to be honest. I mean, if Mitsuba can be used to reliably trace PSFs, then we should totally try to see whether this embeds in an end-to-end optimization pipeline as well. So absolutely, I think this would be an exciting thing to try.
Thank you. Interesting potential exploration there.
Absolutely.
Okay, more questions from the audience. So I've got a question here. The image quality may be very sensitive to certain optical parameters, such as the curvature of a certain surface. Can we comfort the influence of the fabrication errors? I guess maybe can we account for the influence of the fabrication errors during the training and designing stage?
Right. So tolerance is a very important point. And of course, you have this design that comes out of your optimization, but then the question is, will you be able to fabricate it, right? And in fact, I think whether so inside the optimization or when we train it, you can take this kind of tolerance into account, right? You can have it tweak. Have the model sort of replicate what a design tolerance would do. Although in this case, I don't think we did anything specifically. So this was kind of we were kind of hoping for the best using manufacturing during manufacturing. And sure enough, the real lenses that we've manufactured were real lenses that were manufactured, so they were subject to tolerance errors. And even despite that, we were able to beat the performance of the nominal design. So I don't think we're not explicitly taking that into account during the optimization. But again, I think this would be an interesting thing to try further down the line.
Thank you. Interesting. Okay. Some further audience questions here. Okay, right, I've got an array of questions. Let me see what I can do with this. So on the denoising experiments, does the BM3D proxy parameter optimization require access to the ground truth images? Or in other words, are you directly optimizing the parameter variables with the test set as training set? If yes, this might demonstrate an upper bound of the BM3D model performance, but not necessarily a realistic measure of its inference capacity on unseen data. I'll let you maybe speak to this first. Thank you.
Sure, absolutely. Actually, I should have brought up the slide back while you were asking the questions. Let me just do this in a sec. It is here. Okay. So for BM3D, we actually used this standard smartphone image denoising dataset, which it is split into train and test. Okay, so we do train on the training set and test on the test set. So there is no overlap between those two. But the audience member asking is right in saying that we are using noiseless, so-called noiseless images as the ground truth, as the targets. All right. And in this case, the noiseless images were obtained using long exposures. Using the same smartphone as the one used to capture the noisy images on the left-hand side. So in this case, we kind of rely on the good folks that have captured the SIDD data set and use the same train test split as everyone else that is reporting results in this big table. So I don't know whether this answered the questions. I hope, and I think there was a second part to it, whether this shows. Oh yeah, if it's like an upper bound to BM3D. Well, in this case, I mean, this is probably. I mean, this is as best as we could make it work, essentially, right? And maybe the question goes to, so would this generalize to another data set? And I think this is certainly a valid concern in the sense that, as we know, right, data sets are biased, and it's never perfectly clear whether an approach trained on one data set would work as well on another data set or on another camera. So this is certainly a valid. This certainly applies here as well, but in this case. As far as sort of fairness of comparison, this is a fair comparison on this data set for all of the methods.
Right, thank you. Got it. Thank you. Okay, and maybe somewhat related is sort of this. There's a follow-up question about the realism, or how realistic is it to assume the f number, the back focal length, and the number of lenses as fixed? And was this assumption motivated by the difficulty of the PSF network to learn or generalize?
That's a great question, and yes, I think this is certainly part of the answer. We wanted to kind of limit, because this thing can explode in a hurry, right? So let me just go back to. Okay, so this is the Cook triplet. Maybe there's a better slide for this, but by restricting ourselves to, let's say, the space of parameters of the Cook triplet, we could hope to train the neural net to correctly sort of span, to correctly model the whole space that is spanned by the set of parameters. Now, if we imagine adding, the possibility of, let's say, adding a lens, or adding another element, or as you said, modifying, the position of the stop, let's say, or the back focal length, and these kinds of things, then this adds a sort of a whole other set of parameters to optimize over. And in fact, it changes the number, the dimensionality, right? You could, if you add a new lens, all of a sudden you have a whole bunch of new parameters that just appeared, right? So you have a very, very nonlinear, very non-discrete set of parameter space to optimize over. So in this case, we kind of assume that the set of parameters is fixed, right? Both for the ISP, so we don't optimize over ISPs. We just take an ISP and optimize over that single ISP. So in that case, in that sense, it's limited to a fixed design, which is what I was. We also discussed this earlier, but certainly further down the line, I think approaches that would look at different set of designs. Maybe I have a 3-element lens. Maybe I have a 4-element lens. Maybe I have double Gauss, right? Or maybe I have another set of optical system. I think this would be fantastic to explore. Yes. But certainly the concern that the network would not be able to model it as well as a restricted set of parameters is definitely there. Yes.
Thank you. I think that's very, very interesting. And a follow-up question on sort of on the nominal optics here. We have a question about the visualization using nominal optics in comparison to what we might expect from a commercial lens design. So in addition with the optimization framework, I guess the question is about is the bottleneck still would a more expressive parametric lens design design frame, is that the bottleneck in the optimization? I guess it's a question about how strong are the nominal optics examples, I think is this. Right.
We actually had this question during review period as well.
Okay.
So maybe we're talking to our reviewer.
Maybe this is your reviewer, right?
That's right. So in this case, we did our best in the sense we did what people are supposed to do, essentially open up Zemax, right, and start with again now the question is whether triplets are a good design or suitable design or not, right? We could argue over that, and we could say, well, you should have used a 12 lens element. Well, okay, maybe, right? But in this case, we tried a very simple optic, and that's sort of the intuition behind it is that we want to produce cheap cameras, right? We want to put cameras everywhere in cars, and maybe cars, of course, have more than one cameras. Now, cell phones have more than one cameras, right? So cars will have tens and dozens of cameras probably. And so we want them to be as cheap as possible. So we'll want simple designs, and whether we can make it simple and make the whole pipeline work, right? By adjusting everything simultaneously is sort of the one of the hopefully key take home points of what I wanted to talk about today. And going back to the nominal design, right? We really did our best in the sense that we did what people are supposed to do and ask experts to do it and say, okay, fire up Zemax and give me the best cook triplet you could find, essentially. Right, using Zemax Hammer, which is the optimization tool within Zemax, and then we had the design and had it manufactured at exactly the same place as the optimized designs were, to really within the tolerances and everything, to really have like a side by side sort of as fair comparison as we could.
Got it. Thank you. Thank you. Okay, and another question here from the audience about optimization, I guess. So here. The audience member asks, we're minimizing a compound function composing of f1, f2 to fi with respect to parameters of each function fi. And the question is, so even if compound functions are differentiable, they're not guaranteed to be convex. And so how are we sure that we're not in a stack of local minima, I guess is the question here.
Absolutely, that's very true, and it's not. Yeah, differentiability does not mean convexity, right? Absolutely not. It just means that we can compute gradients to it. And let me just go back to the slide where I did kind of briefly mention it. And yeah, so this is what I meant by saying here. I keep talking about end-to-end design, but we don't actually perform end-to-end optimization just by saying, okay, initialize everything randomly and then backprop and hope for the best, right? We are going to be, if you do that, you are going to be stuck in a local minimum. And yeah, that's actually what happens. So the way we actually do it is using this this proximal optimization. And what this ends up being is this sort of, again, piecewise optimization, but doing this in a loop. Okay, so the way this works is that, let's say you start with a computer vision network, which has by far the most number of parameters. That guy, we can initialize it using, pre-train it, basically, right? So you pre-train it on a data set. Let's say for autonomous driving, you could pre-train it on Kitty or Cityscapes or whatever. So you pre-train it in order to initialize it to a decent set of weights that will at least be able to detect some objects in images. And then you can also pre-train or initialize the ISP to produce, you know, good looking images, and same for the optics. And then afterwards you kind of plug these all in, and then you do a step of optimization on, let's say, the optics, while keeping everything else frozen. And then you after doing that for a little bit, you stop doing the optics and you move on to the ISP. You optimize that for a little bit as well, while keeping the other two fixed. And then you do so for the computer vision network, and then you go like this in sort of a round robin fashion. Okay, so by doing that, this is still, there's no guarantee that we'll hit a global minimum. There's definitely not. However, we found experimentally through all of these different applications that this actually was able to make it work to reach a local minimum. It's still going to be local, but that is going to be better than the one you reached if you just kind of initialize everything randomly and then just jointly optimize everything. And the reason for that is that sometimes it's hard to balance the gradients, right? So some parts of the whole pipeline might take bigger steps or smaller steps than the others, right? So it's really hard to kind of have everything balanced out. So for this reason, by sort of jointly, but sort of in turn, right, optimizing everything, we found that it was able to converge to a better local minimum.
Very, very interesting. Thank you. So yeah, so if I understand it, I guess this sort of round robin optimization, this is doing better than just a vanilla gradient descent and pressing go and allowing everything to go at once. Interesting.
That's right. That's right. There's also another little tweak, which is some regularization that will, you know, it's a mouthful, that will ensure that whenever you optimize a block or a module, you never go too far from where you started from, essentially. So you have this regularization term that says, don't go too crazy, you know, just everyone wants to take a step that's more or less the same size, and then we go in round robin. So there's this additional tweak.
Got it. Thank you. Thank you. Okay. So
I hope I'm still live because I think I lost you, Stephen. Okay, I think we're still live, and I think we lost Stephen. Sam has asked you, Matteo, to jump in if you're there. I cannot.
Hi there, this is Sam from behind the scenes. Oh, Matteo, are you good to go?
Yeah. I also had some.
Got a camera?
Sure.
Brilliant. I'll put you live now.
Okay, cool. So I think, yes, Stephen has already forwarded the last question that we have from the audience. Maybe I would like one more, if you like.
Sure.
So thanks,
absolutely,
by the way, for the presentation.
Thank you. Sure.
Maybe I missed it, but how exactly do you feed the parameters of your model to the to the model that is doing the proxy modeling?
Okay, I'm not quite sure.
So if you go, for example, to like when you were describing to train the proxy model for BM3D, right? So you are informing the model of some hyperparameters, right? That you then can adjust after the training.
Right. Yeah.
So how exactly do you inform your differentiable proxy model with these, let's say, parameters?
Okay, so we have this. Maybe I can walk through this example quickly, just to make sure I follow your question. So here we're given BM3D, right, which is this black box algorithm that takes an input image, and produces a hopefully denoised output image, right? And in this BM3D, you can drive it with a set of hyperparameters. Mm-hmm. Right? You could say maybe the size of the boxes, or it's like a patch-based algorithm, right? The size of the patches and the number of patches you want to average over, that kind of stuff. So there's a set of hyperparameters. So what we'll do is that we know the set of hyperparameters, and we don't know the algorithm, but we can query the algorithm by saying, here's a set of parameters, here's an image, give me the output image that you will produce. So we query this algorithm using many different images, using many different set of parameters, and get training data for the proxy. Then we'll train the proxy on this to replicate what the BM3D algorithm does given an input image and given an input set of hyperparameters. Right? So this is the proxy training stage. Does that make sense?
Right.
Okay, great. So now that we have trained this proxy is now a differentiable machine or so that will replicate what BM3D does, but is now differentiable, right? So now we can give it this set of training images and say, okay, here's an input noisy image. I want you to generate me this noiseless image at the output. So now you run the image through BM3D, you get the output, which might not be noisy, but you compare the output with the ground truth target noiseless image, and then that gives you a loss. You compute the loss on this, you backpropagate the loss through the proxy without changing its weights, right? So now the proxy is trained. You don't change the weights. Now you backprop through all the way to the input the hyperparameters. And then you take a gradient step in the input hyperparameter space, and you keep doing that again. Does that make sense?
Right. Okay. Yeah. Thanks.
Yeah. So this is essentially the exact same. So this is BM3D, which is a software ISP, right? So an ISP doesn't have to be hardware; it could be software. So this is exactly the same approach as I was mentioning when I just described this sort of at the beginning of the talk, where you have this. This is for training the ISP, the proxy function, and you backprop through to get the optimal weights. And once it's trained, then you're given a task. You fix the ISP, right? You have the parameters as input, you have the output, you have the target, you have the loss, and you backprop through it all the way to the parameters. So this ISP could be hardware, could be software, doesn't matter. So we just chose BM3D because it's like very well known. A lot of people have been using it. It's been around for a decade. And we just say, well, this is a good example because it's also non-differentiable. It's more or less black box. We don't really know what's happening inside of it, right? So we can fit this differentiable proxy to it and find a good set of parameters.
Okay, so just as a follow-up, so in your case, this model then should be able to simulate any sort of combination of these hyperparameters. Is that correct?
Right, that's right.
Okay, so for example, just to go back to this specific BM3D ISP, right? So you say the different patch sizes, for example, will result in different performance.
That's right.
So that's quite a difficult thing to sort of train your proxy for, right? So how do you exactly do that? So that was my kind of original question. So how do you inject this kind of very abstract sort of information into a way that the model can be informed and therefore simulate this behavior?
Yeah, right. So we do this entirely from data. Essentially, so for this, you don't actually need images from the SIDD dataset, right? You can just rely on any image. You give it any image as input. Let's say you randomly sample this set of parameters from BM3D. And of course, when you say randomly sample, then there's always questions of, okay, do you actually, like, what distribution do you use? Is it uniform over, the set of reals or whatever within a range? So for this, we defined a range, right? So we defined a range that kind of makes sense given BM3D. For example, patch size, right? You cannot have negative patch size. So, you can have a patch size of 0. You cannot have a patch size that's bigger than the image, right? So you just restrict yourself to a set of a range of reasonable values. But within that range, it's not really clear which one to do. So you just essentially randomly sample a set of hyperparameter, you run it through BM3D, you get the output image, right? And then you just keep doing that on many different images. And that just generates you the training data more or less for free, right? So you have this, it's sort of self-supervised in a way, right? So you can just, you give it an input image, you give it a set of hyperparameters, you run it, you get the output, and that gives you the mapping between inputs to outputs. We never actually inject any knowledge of, oh, this parameter is like the patch size, so it should do such and such. Or this parameter is like the sigma of the Gaussian or whatever, so it should do such and such. We never actually do this explicitly. This is purely kind of learned from the data.
Okay, I got it. Yeah, that's quite interesting. Thanks.
Awesome, thank you.
And I think Steven is also back.
I'm back. Apologies for that.
Welcome back.
Thank you.
We were lost there for a second with that.
Right. Apologies. My apologies. Okay. Thank you very much for fielding all of these interesting questions. So I don't see any additional audience questions. So I think we might end the session there. And it remains to say thanks very much, Jean-François, for the truly interesting and informative talk. And also thanks to our audience for stimulating discussion. And I'd say to people, keep an eye on our website for our upcoming next events. And thanks very much. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Thanks everyone for listening.